Mr. Brown, thank you very much indeed. I suppose my first question is that child poverty is an issue that's never really gone away, but what's your sense of how bad it is in 2025 Britain?
Child poverty is the biggest cause of social division in our country. I don't think many people realise just how poor the situation of so many children are. There's 1 million children who are near destitution, and that means they're without some of the basic essentials, whether it be housing, a shelter, or whether it be food, or whether it be, for example, basic hygiene essentials. And then there's 2 million children living in homes that either don't have a cooker or a fridge or a washing machine, and are certainly without some of the basic sort of toiletries like soap and shampoo. There are 3 million children who are having to skimp meals because there's not enough food in the house. And then officially there are 4.5 million children under the government's own definition of poverty in poverty. And that's the biggest figure in the last 60 years when figures started being collected. Now, it's the result of, if you like, the social security changes made under the Conservatives. So they are essentially austerity's children. But now is the time, with the budget coming up, to think of what we can do. There's a child poverty review that the government is asking for consultation on, and that's where I'm giving my views.
Yeah, and also this big give. Talk to us what that's all about.
Well, the crisis support system in Britain has really suffered, and if something goes wrong in the family, if there's an illness, if there's cancer, for example, if there's a death, or if there's a redundancy, where do people turn? Because the normal social security system is not really providing for them. And that's where charities come in, and it's where corporate giving comes in, and it's where food banks, of course, 2,600 in this country. Fair Share is another food organisation. And what we do is, we're like a food bank, but we provide bedding, we provide toiletries, we provide furnishings, we provide baby goods, we provide clothes. And so we take a holistic view of the needs of a child. And at the same time, we want not just to provide a safety net, we want to provide a springboard so that children and the family can move out of poverty. So that's what the big give is, to raise money for the goods that we provide.
I think it's fair to say that you're essentially now campaigning on this issue of the 2-child benefit cap, aren't you? But at the end, the argument against it is we can't really afford it. I mean, it was imposed when public finances were not in a great state. They've got somewhat worse since. Can we really afford it?
Well, I understand the difficulties the government faces. I mean, the fiscal position in every European country is difficult, partly because defence spending is having to rise as a result of the Russian threat, partly because of the ageing population, a whole series of reasons. The energy transition is another costly business. But I've suggested during the course of the summer that if you look at a number of areas where money is available, then you can provide the funds to tackle child poverty. Now, if we tax the gambling industry fairly, the gambling industry, let's say the tax on online gambling in Delaware in America is 57%, it's 21% in Britain. Machine gaming is taxed around 25% in Britain, higher in other countries. If we tax the gambling industry fairly, they're mostly offshore companies, they don't pay VAT, they don't normally pay corporation tax if they're not based in Britain, of course, then we could raise money. If, of course, the banks, which deposit money at the Bank of England, were paid less than the 4% interest rate they're getting, which is perfectly reasonable, we never used to pay interest rates at all, then we could raise some money. So I'm not suggesting find the money from breaking your election promises. I'm not suggesting find the money by breaking your fiscal rules. I'm saying here are sources of money, and if you've got to choose between fair taxation on the gambling industry and not helping children, let's help the children who are in desperate need, and we can do it immediately. And the problem is the figures will continue to rise as a result of the 2-child rule if we do nothing, because every year another 50,000 children join the ranks of being poor the minute they're born.
And is this going to be a factor potentially in who you might support in the Labour deputy leadership race?
I'm not getting into leadership or deputy leadership elections. That's for the Labour Party MPs and then for the membership. But it's clear
the party is divided on this issue, or at least
at odds with the leadership. The important thing is the policy. And I think most sensible people, when they look at the policy, they say, what is the most cost-effective way of taking 500,000 children out of poverty? What is the, if you like, the cheapest way of getting that number down? And that's the number we have to get down to go back to the situation we were a year or two ago. And the most cost-effective way is abolishing the 2-child rule, and that's less than £3 billion. Now, that can be done, and I would have thought both deputy leadership candidates actually would want to support that.
What about the Prime Minister or the Chancellor? Have you talk to them in private about this? I mean, you clearly feel very passionate about it. It's something no one could ever accuse you of coming lately to. I mean, you've cared about this issue for a long time. I mean, have you spoken to Keir Starmer already?
Yeah, I've spoken to Keir Starmer, and Keir is very sympathetic. But I mean, nobody wants to see, nobody I know in the country, whether conservative, reform or liberal or nationalist, would like to see child poverty rising. So I've talked to him and I've talked to other people. I'm happy to talk to any party about this, and certainly the charity that I work with, Multibank, is happy to talk to everybody about what could be done. And I think they're pretty sympathetic to what needs to be done. And the question is, do you take the opportunity of the coming budget, which is probably the last date on which you can be sure, if you took a decision, you could reduce child poverty next year and the year after? Do you take a decision in that budget? And I'm saying, look, here's the money. I've shown you where it can be done. I used to be a finance minister, a chancellor, so I know where you can find money. This is the money. This is what needs to be done. Let's take the first 500,000 children out of poverty, and we will actually relieve the poverty of 900,000 children by the measure I'm suggesting. And that's the start, because every child needs the best start in life.
Frustration that there's a Labour government in power and that you're having to make this case publicly.
Well, actually, there's a child poverty review, and I'm joining the consultation. So there's thousands of people who have had the chance to join the consultation, and I think it's important that everybody puts their view. This is not a criticism of the government. The criticism is, if anything, of what hasn't been done in the last 10 years when things have got worse and worse and worse. So the consultation is the chance for me to put my view. And of course, the government's policy on this is not yet formed because they're listening to the consultation.
Can I just pick up on the term that you used? I thought it was really interesting to talk about it's the greatest cause of social division in this country. And I'm really keen to think what you thought of that march on Saturday, because there's a whole load of reasons why people came out, 150,000 of them, or maybe are supporting Nigel Farage, who want to see the cap removed. Is it, in essence, people's frustration with politics, with the government at the moment, because effectively living standards haven't really risen very much, and that there is such child poverty in this country?
Yeah, in every country in Europe, in fact, America and every country in Europe, there has been this rise of what you might call the populist nationalist right. So if you look at the opinion polls in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Netherlands, in Belgium, in Hungary, and in Britain and America, there's a populist nationalist upsurge.
Is poverty part of that?
And yes, I think people's frustration at the financial position that they're in has been a huge problem. And if you're concerned about standards of living, obviously you're concerned about everybody's standards of living, particularly those people who've fallen behind. And I think this is a feature of people's frustration right across Europe. But, what you've got to do in these situations is bring people together. We cannot have the politics of division. We cannot have people out there in the streets practicing the politics of divide and rule. The time when this happens and people feel frustrated is the time to bring people together and say, what do we have in common? What is it that defines Britain? And what defines Britain is a sense of fair play, and that everybody should have a decent chance in life and a sense of decency. And that's why I focus on child poverty, because if you want to look at the moral compass of our country, the moral compass of our country is that every child should have the best possible start in life. Every child has a potential, has a talent to fulfill. And if we could give every child the chance to fulfill their potential, then that's not just a moral issue of dignity for every child, it's an economic issue, because the benefit to the economy. We did a thing called Sure Start when we were in government, and the government now is trying to reintroduce it. And we found that the Sure Start expenditure on the early years of children, on their health and on their education, it yielded twice as much in benefit as we had spent in actually doing the programme. And it helped people get jobs, helped people stay out of hospital, help people stay out of juvenile delinquency.
And just on that, just finally on this thing about social division, and you look at those images on Saturday, and you say that people need to remind of what unites them together. You're kind of uncomfortable seeing essentially the rise of the populist rights. What does it make you when people clearly are very frustrated out there, aren't they?
Yeah, well, populist nationalism is basically saying it's us versus them. There are people that really don't form part of your society. You've either got to kick them out or you've got to do something to neutralise the voice. And we have got to preach the opposite message, that it's us and us, that we're all in this together. Yes, you've got to manage migration. Yes, you've got to come down heavily on crime and people who try to exploit crime. But at the same time, you've got to have a message, and I think this is what Keir Starmer is trying to do, is to bring people together and say we have got more in common than what divides us. But one of the things we have in common is a sense of social justice.
So just two final questions before I let you go. I must ask you about Lord Mandelson. You famously obviously brought him back into your government when you became Prime Minister, and you've known him for a very, very long time. Do you think Keir Starmer was right to appoint him as ambassador?
Well, look, the personal tragedy is actually of all the women that were molested and trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. And I think anybody who looks at the history of these years and what's happened has got to think first of the women who were affected, people who were juveniles, people who were not even of age for consent, were really traumatized by the experience they had at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. So my thinking about this is that we have got to just remember the victims. And if people have been callous about the victims, or if people have ignored the suffering of the victims in the interests of other things, then I think that's got to be pointed out. So I wouldn't want to talk about any individual here. I would want to talk about the suffering of the victims.
But I mean, it does, you know, it's a pretty difficult time for the Prime Minister. It does call somewhat into his judgment, doesn't it?
Look, every government goes through difficulties. Probably 15 years ago when I was in government, you'd be asking me questions about what had happened on a particular day. But this is not really, in the end, about personalities. In the end, it's about the policies. If you ask people in the street, they might say, well, interesting story, terrible thing that happened to these girls. But also they will say, look, what's happening to my life at the moment? What's happening to my community? What's happening to my industry? What's happening to the whole region? And I think we've got to think that politics is about changing people's lives and making a difference in those areas where they want to do things.
It's also about judgment, though, isn't it?
I don't want to criticise Keir Starmer's judgment, because he faces very difficult decisions, and we're talking about a very narrow area for timing between a Tuesday and a Thursday. I think once the record is out, Keir Starmer will be completely exonerated.
I was just wondering, you, as you rightly said, you know, being in Downing Street is not easy. What's your advice to Keir Starmer during what is, let's be honest about this, a pretty difficult time?
Well, I used to say to him, my advice is not to take my advice. But for Keir Starmer, look, he will be judged by the changes he makes in the Britain that he said needed reform and needed change. And I think you've got to give him the time to do that. I mean, most parliaments last 4 or 5 years. We're already just past the first year. And Keir Starmer deserves the opportunity. The British people voted for him to show what he can do. And I think his focus is on the economy, and his focus is on rebuilding civic society, and his focus is on keeping Britain safe and secure. And I think once you judge him on these things, you'll find that he's doing the things that are right for our country.